Round comes around.
Okay, so we're live. Welcome, Senator Bray. We're going to hear a little bit in the next hour about some bills that impact Act 250 and land use development regulations and zoning, et cetera. There's an incredible amount of crossover between housing development and those issues. We're just getting started on this. I hope, I've been talking with Senator Bray, I hope we have the opportunity also to go into his committee and explain what we're trying to do so we can get on the same page. So this should be a good introductory hour of what's going on down the hall.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Good to see you all. As a Economic Development Committee alumnus, this is like Old Town Day or something, coming back in, and the issues we're all working on actually haven't
Changed much.
Changed. Housing is an ongoing challenge. So I just stepped out of testimony on Act 250 and planning more broadly on its impacts on development, particularly housing and affordable housing. So I think my sense is that I have yet to meet a person who doesn't want to see more housing developed in the state of Vermont, including affordable housing, and would love to see that is well planned, well implemented, and delivered in a timely way. The challenge that I think we all face every year actually is to try to, Karen Horn was just giving testimony when I stepped out, and she called it a Gordian knot. So I don't know if it's going to be that difficult, but it is hard to disentangle the different levels at which we regulate and plan and figure out which ones of those could be improved in a way that makes our progress towards building more sooner, more affordably possible. I would say, our conclusion so far is that there is no outright major flaw that is holding back housing. And I guess, we're also very cognizant of the pressure that's coming because we have ARPA dollars that need to be committed by the end of 24 and expended by 26. And everyone is keen to make sure that any dollars available to support housing are deployed successfully in that time. And then it's not government, at least, getting in the way of achieving those ends. I think there are other things outside our control to some degree that are going to be big challenges that we haven't talked much about, namely workforce. I know that, and I'm sure that you're talking about that piece of workforce. We're talking about workforce as it relates, for instance, to weatherization. So we all have our own workforce challenges. So, S234 and S200, I think, is the other bill. They look at two different ways of trying to accelerate our progress on housing and development more generally. The first bill, let me double check the number. Yeah, S200 is Senator McCormick's bill. And he takes the master permit approach that we already have in law that we use for industrial parks, basically to issue a master permit for an area. And then you only come back for an amendment in order to add individual projects in underneath that master permit. That's been an option since something like 2007 and not yet invoked by a municipality to do its development. So I don't know the reason that it's not being used, if it's too onerous a process or what it is, that maybe time and expense is front loaded in that master permit, and that's daunting, but I'm only speculating. Anyway, we haven't had, as it were, takers on that strategy to date. Maybe it could be successfully retooled a bit to be more useful to more municipalities. The S234 bill takes the approach of saying, can we do an enhanced designation that would layer over the current designations that says, okay, when you've, and it was called a smart growth designation. Once you have that then you the permitting, your involvement in Act 250 ceases. In essence, you have a solid planning process at the local level that is as vigorous as Act 250, but it's all managed at the local level, other than the requirements still that you would have, for instance, to work with A&R, for instance, on stormwater permitting, things like that. So state permits still exist, but you're not going to the district commission. You're doing all the work locally. And I think the thought there was to do more work locally, so there was less bouncing between different entities, RPCs, plus district commissions, plus state agencies like VTrans and A&R. Would that be helpful to have more things handled all in one shop? And then I think also that we were recognizing the general planning construct of those who live in a place know it best and may be best suited to doing the planning, because they have the most interest in seeing a good outcome, and they know the place that's being planned for better than someone based out of either a district commission office or Montpelier. So, however, I'd say what we're hearing so far is that it's a lot of work to become a designated area already. It takes time. For instance, we were hearing from, let me see, Elizabeth Bridgewater from the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust, who was saying they went through getting a neighborhood developed. It's either an NDA or a village center designation for Putney. And it was a great process, very helpful, but it took 18 months start to finish. So, as we contemplate adding any kind of additional designations on, it runs counter to it runs in the face of the idea that we also want to be able to deploy money sooner rather than later. So I think that's the tension we're feeling. And I would say, frankly, about the 234 idea of another designation, it's not that well received. It's like, wait, we're already working to achieve one designation, and now you set the bar a little higher to gain us more freedom on implementing, making more decisions at the local level. So it may be that it's just too burdensome to be practical, and there would be no takers. So that's really, we haven't decided that as a committee, but I'm just being frank. I don't feel like the construct, although people understand it, appreciate the idea of making more local decisions, the obligations, the amount of work and time to gain the designation necessary seems to be an impediment in and of itself. And I think municipalities are already out straight on handling other work through, for instance, trying to figure out what to do with their ARPA dollars. So additional work doesn't seem to be welcome at the moment. So it's not a decision. I'm just trying to share with what's happening. There was a lot of appreciation for the municipal planning grants that came out in the boost that came out last year. And I think there's another increase contemplated this year. Towns were finding that very useful. So let me pause there. And
thank you for that, Senator Bray. I was going to, in listening to that, I guess it was a different variation on the concern, not fully appreciating how the municipalities would react, at least the larger ones. But I was wondering how it would fit for the small towns, how they could, handle all that kind of review that may be, hopefully would be comparable to what Act 250 presently required, and where they would have the wherewithal. But I think you're already getting that feedback on the municipal planning grants that we've increased and we're increasing more. Are there any strings attached to that added money? In exchange for getting that money, do they have to abide by any kind of guidelines at all?
This seems like a good Chris Cochran question. I know that in our bill, we provide along the very same lines, it's actually modeled on what you've already done, which was, okay, if we're going to ask someone to gain an extra designation, let's provide technical support and funding to do the work. But even with that offer of support, I think it's more than my sense is. We're seeing that that's more than people are ready, willing, and able to take on. But I want to pause and ask for Mr. Cochran. This is like phone a friend.
Oh, yeah, no, that's great. And Chris has been really good about being present for our discussions. Yeah, I like incentives in grants. I just don't like blind grants going out to people without some guidance. So tell us a little bit about these municipal players. This is different than the modernization grants, right?
Yes, they are.
Chris?
Thank you. Chris Cochran from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Yeah, generally speaking, the municipal planning grants are very broadly, they can support a whole range of activities within a community. We really look to the community to set their own priorities. That said, the department sets priorities each year. Typically, the priorities are around kind of what the challenging issues are that we need to tackle. For several years, it's been housing because we wanted to support bylaw modernization. Thankfully, with your support, we now have a very targeted bylaw modernization grant that was hugely successful in getting communities to actually tackle that. And Senator Bray, to your point about Putney and the example of it taking a long time for them to modernize their bylaws, we now have 41 communities with bylaw grants. And while it will take them, probably a year to update their bylaw grants or to complete their bylaw modernization, it sets them on a perfect path to achieve that neighborhood designation. So just to quickly answer, they're broadly enabled. I think your work last year in this committee to target, within a subset of the municipal planning grant investments to focus on bylaw modernization is a smart move.
Senator Bray, I've been hearing a lot. I don't know a lot, but I've been hearing a lot about Representative Bongart's bill dealing with housing development. Have you been privy to any of that? Have you discussed any of those ideas in your committee? I know it's a different chamber, obviously, but.
Yeah, no, I've read the bill a couple times, and the same, no surprise, some of the very same topics he's addressing are coming up. And I think we've considered some of the same things. So 234 is really a bill very much live and in development. And I think we're looking for, best practices regardless of where they come from. So for instance, one of the things addressed in there is the caps that are currently population-based caps on how many units of PHPs, how big they can be. So I think at the lowest population level, like 3,000 to 6,000, it's 25 units. These numbers may be wrong. Chris Cochran could toss these right off, but it gets doubled to 50 units, for instance. So, and at the highest in the largest towns, the cap is removed entirely. There'd be testimony to take about what the consequences that would be, but I think the driving force behind it, as I understand it, is to provide for economies of scale and not necessarily constrain even a small town that 25 units may be too small to satisfy the needs they might have. I also wanted to mention about priority housing projects. I mean, this has come up as, so the construct we're working with is this designation, and it lets you work entirely locally at sort of the Act 2, another pathway that's Act 250 like, but it's all locally implemented. A potential unintended consequence, though, of letting people in these areas leave, Act 250 jurisdiction, is that it removes an incentive for PHPs, which is being exempt from Act 250. So what we're looking at is how we might maintain the incentives for PHPs, because we certainly don't want to disincentivize them. And I know that's, a concern to lots of people. We have had some encouraging testimony from builders saying they actually see it as an opportunity. They're not just talking about include the 20% threshold of affordable housing in a PHP as a burden, but they're designing for that and feeling like it's a better project for doing so. So,
So
positive on that side. But
personally, I don't know if you were involved in writing the thresholds on PHP back many years ago, but how do you feel from an environmental standpoint on the need to preserve Act 250 on a higher amount of housing? Do you feel comfortable with that?
well, it's my stand really on all this has always been good planning is good planning, regardless of the locus at which it's happening, whether that's the district commission, the RPC, the municipality, the state, some combination of them. And that may be somewhat heretical for a natural resources and energy chair to say, but I do think Act 250, we all know, is 50 years old, and there was very little capacity at the municipal level to do the kind of planning work that we need. So if there's capacity at the local level to do that good planning work, it does make sense to me to say, why wouldn't we enable those people to carry on that work? I think what's unique to Act 250, though, are the environmental impacts related to development. And I think that probably is something that is appropriate to remain with the state, So maybe what I'm really talking about, and this is an emerging sort of understanding based on the ongoing testimony, is that development in developed centers, the environmental impact of it is it's already a highly impacted area environmentally. It's not the sort of natural resource concerns that when you are getting sprawl or into current green spaces. So the better we do in that compact development in areas already impacted, the less pressure there is to sprawl outside of town and impact the green spaces. So I think, I want to be careful here. Act 250's played a vital role and continues to play a vital role in many ways. So I'm appreciative and supportive of it. But when we're in a really developed center, it may be that it's not the best tool for doing additional development, particularly in a timely way and to address housing.
Okay, so I guess my question, and we'll continue to work together on this. I'll be simplistic here. If we raise the thresholds for priority housing projects, does there need to be any more guardrails that accompany that? Or is it just, have you been convinced at this point what works for 25 presently times have changed and they could easily work for 50 without any additional changes? I know it presents an opportunity to do something different because developers would like to see, and a lot of housing advocates would like to see, greater density and faster construction. But, are we really losing anything if that's all we did is change the number in a law? In your opinion, anyhow.
Yep. So we haven't taken any testimony on those thresholds. We've just talked about them, and more than once it's come up several times over in committee discussion and with witnesses. So I'm not prepared at the moment to sort of commit a committee position on the thresholds, but I would say we're also not reacting against that at all. We're open-minded about, moving those. I appreciate your desire to deliver incentives with guardrails, and I think the guardrails are always aimed at trying to avoid unintended consequences that actually no one wants to see. But what I keep realizing every year, or have to realize, is that it's given that every single municipality is unique in some ways, it's very hard to be writing a general law that's going to be as successful across the board.
Well, forgive me if I'm making this simplifying this too much, or I'm misunderstanding something, but if we were to raise the guardrail, the threshold from 25 to 50, there potentially would be projects that are now under Act 250 jurisdiction that wouldn't be. And I realize some people say there's no need to have those projects under 250. And I guess both of our committees need to explore that option, that question before we make that change. And it's under added pressure of trying to find ways to develop less expensive, more timely, and greater number of units. So that's the question. It sounds to me 234 tried to skin it in one way. It's running into other problems from localities and stuff. And I don't know. And maybe it would be a good time to turn to Chris Cochran, because he may know a little bit more about the bill in the House. Are there any other additional guardrails imposed accompanying the increase in the priority housing project threshold?
Yes and no. So right now, you can have a priority housing project in many of the designations, with the exception of the village centers. I think Senator Bray's committee heard testimony this morning that the designations were created for kind of different purposes than exemption from Act 250. They were aimed at targeting tax credit benefits to a very, very narrow area, because we didn't have a lot of tax credits and we wanted to make sure that they were going to the right locations. So similar to Senator Bray's framework, we have our existing add-on designation called neighborhood development areas that layers on top of the existing designations. It requires additional bylaws to protect important natural resources, to ensure that the community is doing a better job. It is not a perfect alignment with Act 250 criteria, but again, the bylaw modernization grants that we just allocated are going to help many, many communities achieve this added on designation. As far as like the impacts of going from 25 to 50, I think, to me, the question is, what are the environmental impacts of these additional units in an already developed center? And what are the environmental impacts if those units get developed elsewhere? What's the loss in creating more homes close to where people walk, work, enjoy the quality of life we have in Vermont? I don't see there's a big loss there. And that's obviously my perspective. I think, the environmental community VNRC may have a different take on this. But I think, it feels like a de minimis impact if we're changing from 25 to 50, so long as it's located in an appropriate location.
Okay. Well, we're not as well versed here in the Housing Committee as Chris is in his committee, so I have to ask these basic questions.
Well, and Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask.
Go ahead, Allison.
So I'm just curious. The two Christophers. It's wonderful to have you both in the committee at the same time. For me to abandon, I'd like to go back to the carrots to get people all on board. And this conversation just reminds me how much we need to revamp our designation programs. For us, I just think for us to be layering one more program on top of another program is kind of silly. And I know Chris Cochran wants to revamp the designations, and I would too. I think that it's about time because we just seem to be adding them. And I'd like to go also back to the carrots that we can use to get communities to do more, which then gives them a green light to do more, but that they have to all be, there has to be there has to be kind of a unified planning foundation for them to get that green light. And we have that in these different designation programs, but I would not like to abandon that. And if an Act 250 overlay, and so this is where my question is, maybe the master plan, I know the master plan hasn't been used much, the Act 250 master plan. I'd like to understand how it could be used better. So instead of abandoning Act 250 in downtowns, for if we expand the priority housing projects, how can we function under a more relaxed Act 250, which I think, or I don't know what the right term is for the master plan, but once you're in the master plan, you're able to do a bunch of things with some review, but without maybe project to project review. I'd like to better understand how we could improve that as an opportunity also. And I also would love to have us discuss that one improvement I think everybody hears about Act 250, which is the number of appeals that are allowable for projects, which is, I think, a huge issue that we have to address, particularly in downtowns and village centers where there are just more eyes on everything, and more neighbors. And so I guess I'd like to understand those pieces of this. And so I
Can, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So I would want to be careful to say that in no way are we interested in abandoning Act 250. Like where
right.
that would, if I've said anything that suggests that, then
No, you didn't.
Then I've misspoken.
You did, but remember the piece that originally came to us was eliminating for belonging in certain designations and doing priority housing projects, not having to be subject to Act 250 is where this original proposal began.
Right. Well, and I don't, want to get into, we sort of a silly legislative semantic thing. We could say, well, we're not abandoning it, but we're replicating the rigor of Act 250 in another process.
Correct.
So, do we call that another pathway or whatever? I think on the master permit.
Master permit, not the.
Senator McCormick, he's the proposer of the sponsor of S200, and he's a former district commissioner and a district commission chair. So he may have firsthand experience with it, and obviously he thinks it's one way of trying to address this puzzle. The basic concept being do the heavy lift up front for a block of, and then as individual projects come in within that block, that you'll only need a permit amendment, and that will be a lighter lift that will be less costly and less timely. So it certainly, there's a rational appeal to it. The fact that it's been available for a long time and it's so little used, I don't know if used in this way to do downtown development work, including housing. I don't know if it's been used that way at all. Ms. Chakowski knows the relevant law, and I'm sure Mr. Cochran as well has seen what's happening out in the real world, if people are using or not using, and why not.
Right. And I guess I'd love to understand why not. If it exists to do sort of what we're talking about in terms of getting a block, getting a community of downtown under one thing, and then just having a variance per project, which seems much easier. Right. I mean, it seems in theory like it would be a master permit would be a smart way to deal with downtown, easing up some of the more challenging pieces of downtown development in Act 250. So,
Well,
I guess I would interject here that process-wise between the two committees, while I understand you, Senator Clarkson, you'd like to know more and pursue that, I think that if that is the direction that the Natural Resources Committee wants to go, then I think it's primarily within their jurisdiction to do that. If they can't get the consensus for that in their own committee,
Yeah.
I don't want to do an end run around that and sort of.
I didn't mean that at all. No, I didn't mean that at all.
No, I'm not trying to be difficult at all, but I'm getting the sense, even though Chris, in all fairness, presented S200 to us, it doesn't sound like it has a lot of legs in his own committee at this point.
Right.
So
Right.
anyhow, but you did the segue. I don't know who brought it. So I think there's a good, you did, Senator.
I did. I mean, I think the designations do need to be reviewed, because I do think, for example, I didn't know that there was that the smart growth, I'd love to know the interplay of the smart growth designation with downtowns, village centers, and NDAs and any other. To me, they're all about smart growth. That smart growth is the overlying principle. I didn't know there was a designation. I know we have smart growth areas, but the interplay with, aren't all designated downtown smart growth areas? That's what they're meant to be, is smart growth, concentrated areas. So anyway, I think it's time for us to do some serious simplifying of the designation programs.
So there is a proposal from the administration. I think it's evolving to where they're supporting even money at this point to do a serious consultant study of the various designations. And we'll certainly, I'm sure Chris will look at that and we'll look at that. But you did raise appeals under Act 250, which I think is a good segue into Senator Brock's bill, perhaps, on 270. I'm not going to ask Ellen to go through 234 at this point until Chris gives us a better indication of where his committee is going to land on that. Maybe, I don't know, Senator Brock, if I've got this wrong, but I think 270 is your bill and it's in natural resources now. And
that's correct.
I don't know if you want to describe it or just turn it over to Ellen as to what that does.
Mr. Chair, can I say something? One last thing before going on. Sorry to interrupt.
I apologize.
Well, no, of course. So Senator Brock will be coming into committee to introduce that bill later this week. So we haven't yet heard it, but we'll be taking it up along with some other Act 250 oriented bills on Friday. So happy to learn more when we do that. But I think the most important thing I learned this morning in testimony before jumping over here was that the current designations were designed for tax incentives, and they're the footprint was small because the amount of money was small, and I think it was trying to make sure that there was enough money to be effective by keeping the areas small. And so although it seems like a perfect sort of target, like bring housing to that area, we don't really have areas that were like preferred housing development areas yet. And that's kind of what we're using these different designations as a proxy for. And so what I'm coming to appreciate is they're not a perfect proxy. And we don't want a perfect bill, and although we don't want to be aiming for perfection and not get any of this work done. But so just sharing that before I need to go back to committee, because I just felt like that was an important thing we learned this morning on our side of the fence over there.
That's good to know and helpful. I want to thank you for coming in. Our process going forward is going to take most of these ideas, whether they're fully vetted or have life to them, and throw them into a omnibus bill and work through them over the next few weeks. So we're going to want to stay in close connection with you, as because there is a lot of things that overlap the jurisdiction of the two committees. But that we're hoping to put one bill together that addresses housing from a lot of different perspectives.
Right.
So appreciate your time and Godspeed.
All right.
Yes.
You too
Thank-
on this side. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good to see you. And
More
we'll
to
send you
follow.
an invitation to come over and talk with our committee, because there is such an important relationship between those developed centers and then maintaining their environmental integrity of the green spaces outside them.
Right. And Mr.
Important.
Chair, before he departs, I would just underscore that. I think that is where, to me, anything that we do to enhance, enable, and further drive development into our downtown and village centers, I want to make sure that we're doing the equivalent protection for the backcountry.
Okay, great.
Thank
All right. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you too.
Okay, Senator Brock, you want to lead us off on 270 and?
Sure, at least very briefly, and then I'll ask Ellen to go through it in terms of detail. But by and large, this is one more bill that's focused on the issue of affordable housing and how can we get more housing than we have right now. It takes a look at priority housing projects and does some slight redefinition to expand what we call priority housing projects. It takes a look at counties that have high demand because their rental rates are higher than those than statewide averages, substantially higher, and adds some changes that are designed to deal with housing in counties with high demand. And the high demand counties right now statistically are Chittenden County and very close Grand Isle County in terms of the numbers. It looks at how we do permitting and deal with Act 250 in those kinds of situations in a somewhat more relaxed way, but still keeping the same criteria. It provides for some sales and use tax exemptions for construction in priority housing projects. And then lastly, and probably more importantly, it looks at this whole appeals issue. If you look at when Act 250 projects are appealed, the average seems like something like 340 some days before the appeal is resolved. And it does something that I think is fairly simple. It adds a judge and a clerk to the environmental court in order to expedite handling of those appeals. And it puts some timelines in setting expectations as to how quickly they will be appealed and or dealt with, and in the event that they're not dealt with, provide some refund of fees paid, which, if nothing else, should serve as an encouragement to get these things done. The costs associated with the environmental court additions, and these are limited service positions, are to be paid for by COVID funds, and we believe that that is possible. That, in a nutshell, is what the bill is designed to do. It probably overlaps some other things that the administration is proposing as well. And perhaps it might be easier to have Ellen go through the bill just to talk about the specifics that's in it.
Okay, that'd be great. When I just wanted to ask a question for either you or Ellen. When you talk about appeals and an environmental judge, you're talking about appeals from decisions of the district commissions. You're not touching anything in terms of earlier levels of citizen involvement. It's just the appeals from the district commission.
That is the intent. It's a decision of a chair of a district commission whether the action has been taken to circumvent the requirements of the chapter shall be considered an act or decision of the district commission. That's what it's focused on.
Okay.
Appeals of any act or decision of a district commission under this chapter.
Okay. Okay. Well, maybe Ellen can educate us a little bit about the whole process, because I'm not au courant on all of that. If there's a lot of delay, even up to an uncertainty up to the district commission decision, but so I'd like to know, how that works, what's kind of standing, who can appeal and things like that. But anyhow, let's walk through the bill and maybe questions will surface. Ellen, welcome. How are you?
Good. How are you? Nice to see all of you this morning. I'm going to put S270 up on the screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, and we have it on
Oh.
our on our webpage if people want to look at it on their iPads.
Yes, it is posted today under my name. Section 1 at the bottom of page 1 is a short title, so this act may be cited as the Vermont Housing Regulation Modernization Act. Section 2 is a findings section. Would you like me to read through the findings?
No.
Okay. I know you're interested in the way that this relates to housing.
I'm not a big findings person. I mean, I wouldn't mind you just generally telling us what it tries to say, but we could read them later, I think.
I do think they're largely related to what Senator Brock was just explaining. It's about expediting housing in the permitting system and delays potentially caused by permitting.
Perfect.
And the appeals, yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, so first is section 3. We have the definition of the definition section of Act 250. First, we have the definition of affordable housing, which is part of the definition of priority housing project. So what this first part does, and the changes on line 10, it's looking at the definition of affordable housing in the rental housing context. So it's adjusting the rate or the calculation of affordability for rental housing. And so it's raising the percentage to say the total annual cost of renting, including rent, utilities, condo fees, does not exceed 30% of the gross annual income of a household at 120% of the following statistics. So it's a change from 80% to 120%. This change actually will match the definition of affordable housing for owner occupied. And so currently those two definitions are slightly different. And so this is making it that owner occupied housing and rental housing use the same metric for affordability.
We're talking about within this program, right?
Yes, within the priority housing project program.
So does this, I'm wondering why they were different to begin with, but does this, in some ways, I understand there's a need and an urgency to deal with missing middle housing. This probably helps with that, but does it in some ways hurt the lower income people in terms of projects? Rental housing projects are more likely to be now targeted to people between 80 and 120% rather than below 80%. Is that practical likely effect? I don't know if either Senator Brock or Ellen are the right person to ask that, but that's a question that comes up in my mind.
Well, I'm not sure that it does, but I do think that where we have a housing shortage is we have a housing shortage, not just the low end, but we have it at the lower middle end of the spectrum as well. And as we are looking for an economic development activity that relates to housing, we can't neglect that. And the fact that we are using one measure for ownership and another measure for rental is simply inconsistent.
I'm not saying I disagree with that.
Yep.
I just want to go into this with
Yep.
my eyes open.
Right. And,
Yep.
and Mr. Chair, could we ground ourselves in what that actually is right now? what that income is, just because even at 120%, it's still pretty low. So, Ellen, would you be kind enough just to remind us what that is? Those real household incomes are?
Sure, and I don't have the chart in front of me, but if you look starting on line 12 through 18, so it's 120% of the highest of the following. So it's county median income, standard metropolis statistical area median income, or statewide median income. So it's the option of the highest of those, and that will depend, I think, county to county, which is the highest.
Yeah, but
I think it's about 60,000. Just throwing a ballpark figure out.
right.
It's I think 61,973 is what I'm looking at right now for a statewide.
Yeah, for household income.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just Googling it.
Okay.
Okay, so next is a further amendment of the specific definition of priority housing project. I've been doing a lot of walkthroughs lately, so I can't remember if your committee has seen this. Oh, your committee actually probably has seen this language in 511. There's a lot of overlap with this bill in 511. Actually, the first few pages are the same as H511.
I don't even remember myself. Did we go through 511?
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
I think,
we did?
is
Okay.
it? Oh no, I'm sorry, not 511. Wait, see,
It's
I'm getting confused because I have quite a few of these.
Right. That's
So,
okay.
all right, so sorry. It's possible that you've seen this language recently, but it amends the definition of priority housing project to simplify it slightly so
Right.
that currently a priority housing project
Yes. Okay.
in designated downtowns, growth centers, or new town centers is made up of either mixed income or mixed use projects. In neighborhood development areas, it's currently only mixed income. And so a mixed use project isn't allowed. And that's when, there's a commercial venture mixed in with the apartments, like if there's a store on the first floor and apartments above. So this is simplifying and lumping those two things together. So any designated priority housing project in any of the designated areas can either be mixed income or mixed use.
Good.
Okay. Section 4 is in the exemption section of Act 250. It simplifies the exemption for permits and permit amendments for priority housing project. Again, currently there's two slightly different procedures for this exemption for if the priority housing project is in a downtown versus when it's located elsewhere. And so this is just striking the downtown language and saying no permit or permit amendment is required for priority housing project in any designated center.
Good.
And then next is a new section added to 10 VSA 6086B. And Senator Brock mentioned this about development in counties with high demand. So currently, under Act 250, there's a process available to development in designated downtowns. It's a simplified, expedited process called Downtown Findings and Conclusions. And it's a shorter list of criteria with a shorter timeline, an expedited timeline under which the agency has to work on the permit. And the other agencies have to respond to a permit application. So this is adding some new language on page 6 that says, housing development in counties with high demand. During any period in which a county's median gross rent is 10% above the median gross rent for the state, the option established under this section, so the Downtown Findings and Conclusions process, shall be available for development under subdivision 6001-3A4, which is the priority housing project within the county for which a permit or permit amendment would otherwise be required. So it's
Okay.
adding this option for an expedited process under this.
So we're trying to loosen the Act 250 requirements for places where there's a severe housing problem, essentially, as defined by that 10% rule. But what are we loosening? I'm not fully understanding that long section here.
Sure. So currently under Act 250, someone who needs to get a permit as defined by the statute must submit an application that addresses the 10 criteria of Act 250.
Okay.
The 10 criteria also include a number of sub-criteria. So there's more than 25 criteria.
Yep.
And so what this does first is that some of it is on page 5 into page 6, but it shortens the list of criteria that need to be addressed. And that is in recognition of the fact that these are projects in a developed area. So less of the environmental criteria are there. It also, and this is actually not shown on this page, it's in the rest of the statute, but it shortens the timeline and it requires the district commission to act within 20 days of the application. It also requires the A&R directly respond within that period as well. So it's a much shorter timeline and it requires them to act within a much shorter timeline than the regular Act 250 process.
How is this different than the leeway given to priority housing projects?
So priority housing projects, if the project meets all of the requirements to be a priority housing project, they are fully exempt from Act 250.
So if I recall, maybe I'm being cynical here, but I sort of, maybe I'm mixing apples and oranges. I thought the requirements for being a priority housing project were not all that great in designated downtowns. I don't know if that's a judgment call or.
What do you mean?
I may be thinking of downtown tax credits instead of priority housing projects, but.
In order to be, what is required of a project to be a priority housing project?
Yes.
So to be a priority housing project, first it needs to be in one of the designated centers.
Right.
It needs to either be mixed income or mixed use. And the mix of that needs to be at least 20% of the housing units are affordable. And then you need to make sure that you're below the cap on the number of units. And I think I hit all of the requirements, but it is a multi-pronged analysis on that.
So it sounds like priority housing project exemption for development purposes is even more liberal or easier to get through than what's being suggested in this section. So I'm wondering, what's the universe of this section? If we heard that it's just Chittenden and Grand Isle County, let's use Chittenden, is it like this would apply to rural areas of Chittenden County that don't have downtown designations, that couldn't get the priority housing? Is that where this becomes most relevant? I mean, it seems like, I guess what I'm saying, and I may clearly I'm not articulating this well, is that that it seems like in Burlington, for instance, you're much better going the priority housing route than using this route of places where the rent's high by 10%. The silence is telling me I should.
Well,
I
that
should-
may be. I mean, the goal, though, obviously, is to expand the location or the ability to create these kinds of projects in counties where there's heavy demand that's not currently being met.
And not within designated downtowns.
That's
Right.
correct.
Because they
Right.
could now get the priority housing,
Yep.
which would be better. Okay, I
Right.
got it.
Mr.
And
Chair,
Chris-
can I
talk-
add something?
Yeah,
Chris,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Chris Cochran, Department of Housing and Community Development. This was a provision that that DHCD worked on several years ago. It was when Commissioner McKay was head of the department. We thought it was a quicker, easier way to help, projects happen in the right locations. However, we found it was very little used. It did not provide the benefit that we hoped it would. The logic seems like it would, but there was not a great deal of uptake on it. So just some additional context.
Well, I guess one question though to raise, Chris, is that was several years ago, and the demand for housing and the shortfall of housing is much greater today, and the real estate market is different than it was when this was first proposed.
Yeah, it's still, although there are fewer criteria, it is still a pretty substantial review process because all of the criteria have sub-criteria within them. So while it is easier and was used to a limited benefit, for a limited number of projects, I think it would be good to hear from a developer how much time and money this process saved them. And to hear from the NRB how frequently, to my knowledge, I can think of 2 projects that used it.
Okay.
Just to frame this issue from my macro perspective, we have this tension between Act 250 and housing development. And politically, we've heard some members say that, if we're going to incentivize more housing develop in smart growth areas, we need to provide further protections outside of smart growth areas. I don't know where we're going to land on that, whether we're going to do those 2 things independently, but this, I would guess environmentalists might have a problem with this. So that's all I'm saying. Okay, let's go on.
Sure. So then section 6 adds that section now to the exemption section. So any housing project that uses that high demand expedited process is not subject to a permit amendment. They're exempt from permit amendments, which is currently true for the existing process. So it's just adding it to the exemption section.
Okay.
Then on page 7, so there's an exemption for priority housing project building materials under the sales and use tax. So the sales and use tax exemption is in Title 32, Section 9743. And so it adds to this list of organizations that are exempt any building or structure that meets the definition of a priority housing project.
Sen Brock, do you have any feel for the numbers here?
I don't at this point. That's something that I think that we'll certainly be asking JFO to take a look at. You clearly, of course, have that balance of how badly do you need priority housing that somehow gets added to the tax rolls, and compare that to whatever you may lose on sales tax on the construction of the materials that go into that project. And I think it's that tension that we do need to have a better analysis of.
Okay.
And then section 8 is at the bottom of page 8. And so this does deal with the Act 250 permit appeals that you were discussing earlier. So it is important here. So it is a decision by a district commission. And so district commissions make decisions on whether or not to issue a permit under Act 250. But it also does include the district coordinator and their decisions, and they make the decisions on jurisdictional opinions. So that is covered. And then that is the part on page 9 where we have the new language. So the environmental division of the Superior Court shall act upon the petition of an appeal under Act 250 within 30 days after receiving the petition, if the decision relates to a project covered under the priority housing project section. The environmental division shall issue a decision within 120 days after taking the action described in this section, if the decision relates to a project covered under the priority housing project section. If the environmental division fails to meet the timelines in subsections B and C, the Natural Resources Board shall refund the applicant any fees paid to the state under section 6083A of this title, and the applicant shall not be liable for any additional fees under the same section, regardless of the final decision by the environmental division on the appeal.
So, Senator Brock, I take it that the administration supports, well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself in terms of the additional judge.
Well, my initial conversation with the administration was supportive of this particular section, and
Okay.
unless something has changed since we first visited with them about it.
Okay, so
I
Ellen,
mean, one of the things that I would just add at this point is, we often in the legislature produce laws that say people are supposed to do things within a certain period of time or do things, period, and then they don't do them. And it becomes consequence free.
yep,
And that's why I put this in here, so it's not consequence free.
no, I couldn't agree with you more. I served on a DRB, and after a while, I asked the planner, I said, so tell me exactly what enforcement we have in the city of South Burlington. He said, basically none. So we're issuing all these decisions and nothing's ever being like followed up on. But yeah, so yeah, it's a problem. And sometimes it's a question of resources. So this,
Sure it is. And that's why, I recognize that there is a resource issue. We want people to move faster, but we have to give them the resources to do it.
Yeah, and you've done that in this bill. May I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
yes,
So Randy, this really addresses the appeals process by limiting the time frame, but it doesn't do anything to limit and that may be sufficient. It doesn't do anything to reduce the number of times one could appeal or the number of parties who could appeal. It doesn't go
That
there.
may be an issue, but it's probably a separate issue than what I was trying to get at very narrowly here. And that is, I just looked at just average time, and that's one of the things in the finding of something like 334 days to, for the average time for an appeal to be dealt with. And whatever the decision is, just make a decision.
Right. So I get that, but that's per appeal. So
Yeah.
for those of us who represent
you've got a point.
housing projects that took 10 years, because really 8 years of that was in appeal process, it's not simply the time frame of each appeal, it's also the number of times
The
things
aggregate. Yeah, I mean, it's like the St. Albans Walmart that took 21 years.
mhm. So, my initial reaction to this is favorable. I'm just, I did have a couple of specific questions. The appeal from the district coordinator on the jurisdictional question does that go to the commission or directly to court?
It goes directly to court. There is a separate, after the district commissioners, after the JO is issued, there is the option to have it reconsidered, so looked at again, but the direct appeal goes directly to court.
Okay. And this change is not in any way targeted to priority housing or housing issues. This is everything that deals
Yes.
with Act 250, correct?
It is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, let's say my initial take is I'm pathetic, especially from a legal perspective, because I know the environmental court is swamped. It seems like we're going to have to we'll have to ask the Natural Resources Committee to take the lead on this, and this bill is in their committee.
Yeah, I was going to say, this isn't in our committee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but to the extent it helps housing, which I think it does,
Yes.
in a significant part, we can certainly tell them that we like it. So I assume we got to go down to section 9, Ellen?
Right, so finally, section 9 is the funding for new short-term environmental judge and 1 law clerk. So they're limited service positions at the environmental court, and there is an appropriation for $300,000 from the ARPA funds for this purpose.
So that may cover a year or a year and a half. My understanding is, I don't know if you can help us here or somebody, that ARPA funds have to be obligated by the end of 2024, but they can be spent up until 2026. So just using this as an example, if we wanted to fund it for through 2026, we can essentially do it with ARPA funds. Just
Right.
that money aside, let's say it's $150,000 a year. So we're in 2022. So we could do 600,000 and have the money obligated for this purpose through 2026. Is that correct, Ellen?
I would suspect so. I would think that 150,000 a year though is not going to be enough. I think it's probably
It's not.
quite.
Oh, it's probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably
For a
not.
judge and a staff
And-
member, you're looking
Yeah,
more
it will be.
It's probably more over like over 200,000. Yeah.
over 250.
Could be.
Yeah, it's probably closer.
Yeah. Let's not be guilty of the same thing we're accusing everybody else of shortchanging. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you, Senator Brock. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take these bills and put them into the omnibus bill, and we'll go through them several times and see whether they fit or not into our omnibus bill.
And may I just add, we look forward, Randy, to your report of how your presentation goes in natural resources.
Will do. Now,
Okay.
Ellen, are you scheduled for that natural resources as well? Do you know?
Yes, and so on Friday, you're gonna go to Senate Natural Resources when I'm here. So when I leave here, I'm gonna go back to natural and do the walkthrough.
Okay.
My schedule, jumping back and forth between you two has been, that was the easiest way we could figure it out.
Okay.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at